I saw the mouth of it. The night Farouk Nazaroff buried my mother, I swallowed 40 milligrams of something a stranger had pressed into my palm at the airport in Almaty, and I did not sleep for 3 days. Not because of the pill. I spat it into a gas station trash can somewhere outside Shymkent, but because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the corridor again. Let me start somewhere that makes more sense. My name is Soraya Vale. I was born in a city that no longer exists under the name it carried when I arrived in it, Leninabad, renamed Khujand before I was old enough to form the memory of its first identity. My father was a civil engineer who believed in symmetry above all things. Symmetrical rooms, symmetrical meals, symmetrical devotion. 5 prayers, equally spaced, a geometry of faith that gave our household its skeleton. My mother, Dilnoza, was a woman whose obedience was so total it had calcified into something she mistook for peace. She passed this peace down to me the way you pass down furniture, without asking whether I wanted it, without questioning whether it still held weight. I was not a rebellious child. I want to make that clear before anything else. I did not rip at the seams of what I was given. I wore the hijab without resentment from the age of 11. I memorized surahs in Arabic without understanding them the way you memorize a phone number, through repetition, through the muscle of the tongue. I believed, or I believed that I believed, which is its own quiet country. At 19, I left for university in Ankara on a partial scholarship. Applied sciences. My father's symmetry again. Useful knowledge, clean outcomes. I shared a flat with 2 women. Gözde, who studied architecture and slept 4 hours a night and survived on chai and spite, and a German exchange student named Bertke, who was so aggressively cheerful she seemed to be compensating for something ancestral. Neither of them cared what I believed. This was the first time in my life I had encountered that particular indifference, and I did not know what to do with it. I kept my practice in Ankara. I prayed, I fasted, I attended Jummah at a mosque 2 bus stops away, where the women were sectioned into a back room with a crackling speaker system that relayed the khutbah at a slight audio delay, so that everything the imam said arrived to us already a half-second behind the moment it was spoken. I found this, privately, intolerable. The cracks were not dramatic. They were administrative. They were the accumulation of small logical frictions. Why the delay? Why the back room? Why did Gözde, who believed in nothing she couldn't draft on paper, seem more present in her own life than I did in mine? Why did the surahs I had memorized feel like a recording of someone else's conviction playing in my chest? I did not ask these questions out loud. I asked them into a journal I kept in a code that mixed Tajik, Turkish, and my own invented symbols, because even in my private writing, I was afraid of being overheard. The summer I turned 23, I visited a Syriac Christian church by accident. I had taken a wrong turn in Mardin, a city carved into limestone, ancient and stubborn, the kind of place that has outlived every empire that tried to name it, and walked through an open door, thinking it was a courtyard. It was the Church of the 40 Martyrs. The interior was dim and smelled of beeswax and something older underneath, a smell I have never been able to name precisely. Cold stone, maybe, and the particular quality of air that has been breathed and prayed in for centuries until it takes on its own character. There was a woman kneeling near the front. She was perhaps 70. Her lips moved without sound. She held no beads. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was utterly still, the way objects are still, lamp, chair, stone, except that her stillness was animated from within, the way flame is still when there is no wind. I stood in the doorway for what must have been 4 minutes before she turned and looked at me and smiled without surprise, as if she had been expecting someone to arrive confused and find something they weren't looking for. I left. I went back to my flat and told no one, but I began reading, quietly, carefully, the way you probe a bruise. I read the Gospels in a Turkish translation I bought from a second-hand stall near the university. I read them the way I had been trained to read nothing, slowly, with disagreement, with my own interjections written in the margins in pencil. I disagreed furiously with portions of it. I found other portions incomprehensible, but there was something in the figure of Yeshua. I could not bring myself to use the anglicized name yet. It felt like a costume. Something in the texture of his encounters that undid me repeatedly. Not the miracles, the conversations, the woman at the well, the man with the withered hand, the way he asked questions he already knew the answers to, not to demonstrate knowledge, but to make the other person hear themselves speak their own truth. My mother died when I was 26, pancreatic cancer, 9 weeks from diagnosis to burial. I flew home. I sat in the women's section of the mosque during the funeral prayers, and I felt a rage so specific and so cold it was almost structural, as if my skeleton had been replaced with something that conducts anger. Not at God. I did not know yet what I felt about God, at the arrangement, at the room within the room, at my mother's face, which I had last seen animated and which I now saw composed into the impenetrable expression of the dead who have passed beyond arrangement into something else entirely. I did not convert in Kujand. I did not convert anywhere technically. Conversion implies a single event, a door that swings on one hinge. What happened to me was more like water finding a level, gradual, physical, inevitable. What happened in the corridor was something else. It was 8 months after my mother's death. I was living alone in a single room in Eskişehir, working as a translator for a small engineering firm. My sleep had become unreliable, not insomnia exactly, but a quality of sleep that felt visited, the way a room feels visited when you return to it and something is slightly displaced. I dreamed without sequence. I woke at irregular hours with my heart performing a specific staccato that felt like Morse code for a word I didn't know. The night it happened, I had not taken anything, had not been drinking, had not been particularly distressed. I had eaten a bowl of mercimek çorbası and read 40 pages of a German novel I was translating for private work, and gone to bed at 10:30. Ordinary. I became aware that I was in a corridor. I use that word because it is the closest English approximates the geometry. Long, enclosed, a sense of direction without visible terminus. But a corridor implies walls of neutral material, implies that light comes from somewhere architectural. Neither was true. The enclosure was made of something that was not matter. The light, and there was light, a dark, saturated kind, the visual equivalent of a frequency too low to hear, came from no source I could locate. It was ambient in the way that grief is ambient in the months after a loss. Everywhere, sourceless, structural. I was walking, or moving in a way that functioned as walking without requiring the mechanical operation of legs. I knew, with the cellular certainty of dreams, that I was going towards something. And I knew, with a secondary certainty that arrived a half-second behind the first, like the imam's khutbah arriving delayed through the crackling speaker, that I did not want to arrive. The sounds preceded the visuals by what felt like considerable time. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only integrity I have left in describing what I cannot fully describe. The sounds were not screaming, though that is what I would use if I were constructing this for effect. They were more fundamental than screaming. Screaming is a communication. It says, "I am in extremity, someone respond." These sounds were not addressed to anyone. They were the audio equivalent of a fact. Then I saw what the corridor opened onto. I have tried 17 times to write this section of the account. I have deleted it 17 times. What I will say is this: it was not metaphorical. It was not the abstracted underworld of myth, not the theatrical fire of medieval illustration, not anything I had been told to imagine. It was a state of being from which all orientation had been removed. Not darkness. Darkness is a condition of light's absence, and light is a thing you can be oriented toward. This was the removal of the capacity for orientation. I understood, looking at it, that the people in it had not lost hope in the conventional sense. Hope requires a future, and futures require time, and what I was seeing existed outside the sequential structure of time entirely. They were not hoping or despairing. They were simply in it, perpetually, in the way that a mathematical constant simply is. The thing that broke me was not the scale of it. It was the specificity. Faces I did not know, but recognized structurally, the way you recognize an expression on a stranger's face because you have worn it yourself. And the knowledge, arriving not through language, but through whatever mechanism dreams use to deliver pure information directly into the body, the knowledge that this was real. Not real like a nightmare is real while you're in it, real like gravity. I turned around in the corridor. I want to be honest. I did not turn around out of courage or righteousness. I turned around because something turned me, a presence that occupied no space and carried no visible form, but was oriented toward me with an attention so complete it felt like being read, not judged, not evaluated, but read, the way you read something you love because you want to understand it more completely, not because you are testing it. The voice, if it was a voice, said a single thing. I will not record it here because it was addressed to me specifically, and rendering it in text would be like handing someone else a letter with your name on it and asking them to receive its contents on your behalf. I woke up in Eskişehir at 4:17 in the morning. The ceiling was the ceiling. The window showed the specific gray of pre-dawn that belongs to no particular hour. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was sitting upright with my hands flat on the mattress in the absolute conviction, unargued, undramatic, physical as a pulse, that what I had encountered in the corridor was not a dream. I called my friend Roxana at 4:30. She was in Istanbul. She never slept before 3. She did not ask why I was calling at that hour. I said, I need to talk. She said, okay. I talked for 2 hours. I have no recording of what I said. She listened with the patience of someone who has learned that there are conversations which require a witness more than a response. The following weeks were the strangest of my life. Not dramatic, quiet, but with the quality of quiet that arrives after a very loud event. A room after a door has slammed, the street after a siren has passed. I went to work. I translated. I ate. But underneath the ordinary operations of my life, something was being reorganized, the way a city reorganizes around a new road that has been cut through it. Everything still exists, but the roots have changed. I began praying again, differently, not toward Mecca, not in Arabic, not through the formal grammar of Salat that I had learned to move through like a figure in a prescribed dance. I prayed in Tajik, in Turkish, sometimes in a wordless interior gesture that had no language but had direction. I prayed to Yeshua because the presence in the corridor had the specific texture, I can only say texture, of everything I had been reading in the margins of the Gospels for 3 years. I was baptized 14 months after the corridor in a small evangelical church in Eskişehir, run by a pastor named Benedict Achuri, who was originally from Cameroon and had been in Turkey for 11 years, and had the kind of faith that is not defensive because it has nothing to protect. He did not ask me to perform certainty I didn't have. He did not require me to denounce my former practice with theatrical specificity. He simply asked whether I believed that Yeshua was who he said he was, and I said yes, and meant it with the same cellular certainty that I had felt in the corridor, not argued into, not performed, but simply present, the way water is present in a glass you've just filled. My father did not speak to me for 11 months. My brother Tohir called me twice, once to express disappointment, once to tell me that our father was in the hospital with a minor cardiac event and that I should know. I flew home for that. My father was sitting up in the hospital bed when I arrived. He looked at me for a long time. He said nothing about religion. He said, "You look tired." I said, "I'm okay." We watched a Russian television program together for an hour and a half, and I held his hand, and we did not speak about the corridor or the church or the letter I had sent him. And in that hour and a half, something was repaired that I cannot name precisely, but that I continue to be grateful for. The catastrophes. I need to address the catastrophes. I do not use that word lightly, and I do not use it for effect. I am aware that in certain registers, claiming prophetic knowledge reads as performance, or instability, or hunger for relevance. I am describing what I experienced in 3 subsequent encounters, less dramatic than the corridor, but carrying the same quality of information arriving through the body rather than through cognition. The first came in February, a year after my baptism. I was in prayer, genuinely in prayer, not performing it, not half present, when something arrived in the quality of an interior image that was not my imagination. I know the difference between images I generate and images that arrive. The images I generate have the texture of effort. There is authorship present, a shaping hand. This had no shaping hand. It showed me water, specific water, coastal, a particular latitude of light, behaving in a way that water should not. I saw cities that I recognized by their silhouettes, losing their relationship with the ground they had been built on. Not catastrophe in the cinematic sense. in the precise architectural sense. I wrote it down. I wrote the date and time in the margin. I told Benedict, who prayed with me and said, "Write it down and hold it." The second came in March, different in character, less geological, more systemic, a sense of infrastructure failing not through disaster, but through sequence, through the collapse of dependencies that had been assumed to be permanent. The feeling that accompanied this was not terror, I want to be precise, but grief. A specific grief that I recognized from my mother's final weeks, the grief that knows the outcome and is simply present with its weight. The third came in April, and I am not going to describe it in full because I do not have the language yet, and because some of what arrives must be held until it has a context into which it can be placed with accuracy rather than alarm. What I will say is that it was the most specific of the three, and that it had a timestamp of sorts embedded in the image, and that the timestamp corresponds to the opening of May. I am 28 years old. I am a translator who prays in 3 languages and sometimes in no language at all. I left something that had shaped the entire architecture of my interior life, and I did not leave it for reasons of culture or politics or convenience. I left it because I saw where the corridor went, and because something in that corridor turned me around, and because I have spent the years since trying to be honest about what I saw, rather than useful. My friend Roxana, who is still in Istanbul and still does not sleep before 3, called me last week. She said, "Do you regret any of it?" I thought for a long time before answering, because she deserved a real answer and not a rehearsed one. I said, "I regret the years of moving through practice without presence. I regret the back room with the crackling speaker. I regret that my mother and I never talked, really talked, about whether the peace she'd calcified into was the same thing as the peace that passes understanding. I do not regret the corridor. I do not regret being turned around. I live in the same room in Eskişehir. The ceiling is still the ceiling. I translate technical documents and German fiction, and occasionally psalms that someone at Benedict's church needs in Turkish. I pray at 4:17 in the morning sometimes, because that is when I wake up, and I have stopped fighting it. If any of this made something move in you, a question, a recognition, a resistance that felt too specific to be casual, don't let it settle back into silence. Like this, subscribe. You weren't here by accident.